The President, please be seated. The court is now back in session. We would like to now hand over to counsel for Mr. Nuon Chea to put questions to the witness.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Poncho, I will do my very best to wrap up my questions before the end of this session so that you can enjoy your lunch soon. My first question to you is again about the situation in the April 75. You have testified about hospitals being evacuated. Are you aware that there are also refugees who have stated that they were kept in Phnom Penh to work in hospitals even after April 75, after the evacuation?
No, I'm not aware of people who returned to Phnom Penh to work in the hospitals. I'm not saying that there were none, but I'm not aware of this.
Thank you. Yesterday and the day before yesterday, you've also testified about people who were present at the French embassy. And one of the people that you mentioned was a person whom you called leader of the CIA. Now, could you tell again on what basis you were saying that this particular person was the CIA leader or CIA chief?
Well, that's what everyone was saying. I don't have any evidence of this, but everybody was saying that, as here, people say that you are a lawyer. It is representing Nuon Chea.
That is correct. But did you get a name from this particular gentleman in those days?
No, I don't know who it was. He was rather a nice person, friendly, and he was always helpful. We had the impression that he wanted to earn merits before dying, as is the Buddhist tradition.
Does the name Frank Snap ring a bell with you?
I didn't know his name, no.
Pre-17 April 75, have you ever heard of CIA networks operating in Cambodia?
I didn't hear about a CIA network in Cambodia, but I do believe that there were CIA agents in Cambodia. It's obvious. For example, we, in the Catholic Church, we were offered assistance from the American government that we refused because it was 37 times more than the budget of the Cambodian social services, and that probably was money from the CIA. But of course, this is just hypothesis. But however, it seems obvious to me that there were CIA agents operating in Cambodia. Yes, it's obvious.
But do you have actual knowledge of this?
No, of course not. But it was obvious that, well, the CIA is everywhere. Americans, as you know, had agents in Vietnam, in Laos, in Cambodia, even in France. It's obvious. But they were not going to wave the flag and say, I'm working for the CIA. It's obvious that they had agents everywhere. How many? I don't know. And it's clear that the U.S. Embassy was an intelligence agency. You don't have to be a graduate from Oxford to understand this.
Indeed, Mr. Witness. Another question for you. Today, but also 2 days ago, you have mentioned Michael Vickery. And 2 days ago, you said to the Chamber that Michael Vickery, who wrote a book, Cambodia 1975-1982, criticized me on several points, and I indeed accept his critics. And I thought that people would receive the same treatment all across the country, but I learned that people were treated differently from one place to another. The plan was common. This morning, you were referring to Michael Vickery as somebody who intelligently criticized you. Would you be able to expand on the specifics of his criticism?
For example, I met him. I said, "You criticized me." And I told him, "It's very kind of you because I respect your work. We are friends, but we had disagreements on the ideological front. We are not on the same side. He's a communist, I am not. But in terms of intellectual work, we do get along." Take as an example, and this doesn't appear in my book, Cambodia Year Zero, but I had realized that even in the region of Battambang, treatment varied between even neighboring sectors. So perhaps I had a tendency to generalize information for all of Cambodia, information that I had on Battambang. I wrote my book in 1976, 1 year after the revolution. So you have to understand, I didn't have information pertaining to the entire country. Mr. Vickery wrote after 1969 or 79, says the speaker, and he was able to be much more specific than I. He talked about what happened in such and such a region and how things happened differently in another region and was able to draw the distinctions between the various sectors. Take, for example, Sao Pim. He was the chief of the Bopia region. I had heard about it, but only in the vaguest terms. And it was only after 1979 that we learned that Sao Pim was a more of a humanitarian, humanist, communist. In Liuk Deg, for example, with Tam Mok. Tam Mok had well-trained his cadres. But this was known after 1979, and it was impossible to know such information beforehand because we didn't know who the people were, quite simply.
In your same testimony 2 days ago, you have referred to Michael Vickery as him stating or him arguing that the discipline was harsher, was different from one location to another. You actually used those words, the harsher discipline. Would you be able to expand on those words?
For example, in my book, I write that it must have been as of January 1976, but I'm not entirely sure. There was a slogan or a directive that emanated directly from the Supreme Organization, Encore le, Kontek Vanak, smash the social class. So in some sectors, this was interpreted as an order to kill people who were not from the class of poor and middle peasants. To understand exactly what that is, I do believe I have a good understanding, but I'm not totally certain. However, in other sectors, it was simply an obligation to force higher social classes to live like peasants. from lower classes. So you can see that several treatments were meted out based on a single directive. In one sense, it was to force people into a certain social class. You must also understand that under democratic Kampuchea, there were very few written decrees. Take, for example, the interpretation and translation here at the ECCC. I speak in French, and it's interpreted simultaneously or through relays into Khmer and English. And so obviously there can be some distortion or loss of meaning. The same goes for written directives. Obviously, there were some common directives, but at the district level, and certainly at the Kum level, that was the reality.
Are you aware that Michael Vickery has not only criticized you on the differences in the execution of policy in the various areas of the country, but also in your selection of refugees, which accounts you have used for your book?
Mais bien sûr que je le sais.
Of course I know. I repeat that I wrote my book
Le 24 octobre 1976. Donc, je n'avais pas la possibilité d'avoir des renseignements sur Kratjes, sur Kompongtiam, sur Swairien, sur Takeo. J'avais des renseignements, disons...
I had general information in the overall region of Battambang. And that included a good number of testimonies, but there were some that also came from Phnom Penh. And I write in my book that a person had left Phnom Penh in a Mercedes. And they arrived at the border in a Mercedes. At the start, I simply could not believe their testimony. And then last year, or 2 years ago, I met the same people at Amiens in France. And once again, they explained to me how that had occurred. So obviously I wasn't collecting testimonies from Battambang or exclusively from the poor, from the rich, but I received testimonies that were honest and that were provided in a very serious manner.
But if we go more specifically into his criticism, he's saying, for instance, that of the 94 refugees whose written accounts form the basis for your book, you list 63 by occupation, and of those 52 are apparently town dwellers, and so he claims 42 of elite status. Have you thought about this while selecting the background of the refugees?
Mais bien sûr.
Yes, well, of course I thought about that. Of course. Yesterday, I'm not sure which one of you it was, you talked about Oreng and the refugee who had most impressed people was a refugee from the north of Cambodia, an illiterate refugee, because it was he who had the most probative information, or the most justifications to hate Angkor. So of course I thought about this, and I was very careful to be discerning. Firstly, refugees were people who were generally recruited from the higher classes of society. And so they did have an inclination to criticize their home country in order to justify their departure. You have to understand that. But it doesn't take away any of the truth or veracity of what they have to say. They do. It's up to me to decipher what they're saying. And I told you before yesterday, and I'm not sure if it was well translated, but when I started listening to the refugees as of 1979, or pardon me, I mean September 1975, and I had a very hard time or didn't believe what they were telling me. And yet, a very honest man told me something which I took note of. And then when everything was becoming consistent and when all of this information was converging, it seemed very true, and that's what led to forging my inner conviction. And this is exactly why I continue listening to Khmer Rouge radio, because some of this wasn't always sufficient. But I sought to understand the ideology. The radio provided me information on ideology. The refugees provided me information on the experiences of the Cambodian people, based on the fact of whether they were from the countryside or from the city, and the convergence and consistency of all of these accounts led to a form of scientific evidence. So don't accuse me of being discriminant and choosing only the elite. That's not true. There were some Khmer Rouge. In fact, there were 2 refugees who said that they were Khmer Rouge. And so I asked them a few indiscreet questions, and then I realized that they were not Khmer Rouge officers at all. Because you have to know that one applies a certain intuition when speaking with refugees. The fact that I spoke Khmer was of huge assistance, because refugees, either rightly or wrongly, sometimes took me for being one of them. And one could sense after a while if the refugee was speaking the truth or if they were being misleading.
Mr. Ponchot, let it be clear, I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm merely sharing the criticism from Michael Vickery, of whom you said earlier that he was intelligently criticizing you. Allow me to read a little excerpt from his book. This is document D222/1.17, that is English page 49, and the ERN number in Khmer would be 00780180. I quote Michael Vickery. The elite nature of this information is even more apparent among the 20 informants, whom he, as you, names and who provided the most important evidence. 4 of them were teachers or students, 3 doctors or pharmacists, 4 technicians, 2 businessmen, 1 court clerk, 4 military, and the remaining 2 unidentified by occupation. And on that same page, Vickery writes, naturally, almost the entire body of their testimony concerns the fate of the urban evacuees, not the peasants in whom Ponchot claims special interest. Could you react on this specific criticism of Michael Vickery?
Effectivement.
Yes, indeed. The first wave of refugees were city dwellers, and among the city dwellers, the first to reach the border were military officers from Battambang, with Seksamit leading them. There was a second wave of refugees, and they were the Chinese. They were the ones who had the most to lose in the revolution. After that, as of January 1976, that was the start of the second phase of the Khmer Rouge revolution. and teachers were being killed. And as of January 1976, we began seeing the arrival of teachers. I recall one called Tu Tri, who was sitting right before me. And there were teachers as well as monks. And then after that, well after that, we saw peasants. So as you understand, there were several waves and increments of refugees over the course of the revolution. A revolution that was to defend peasants and to support peasants, a class that to which I belonged, and they were chasing peasants. So obviously the questions emerged. But when I was writing my book, the majority of peasants had not left. Most of the refugees were mainly from the cities. That I grant you.
Thank you, Mr. Poncho. Now, there's somebody else who has been criticizing you as well when it comes to the selection of the refugees. That's a person called Gareth Porter. And he is saying that these refugees that you spoke to were the ones that were deliberately trying to blacken the regime they just had fled. Would you agree with this particular criticism?
Very well. I can somewhat agree with the criticism being launched by Gareth Porter, but it's not a very admissible criticism, if you will. A refugee doesn't necessarily tell lies, and I was sufficiently attentive, and I was very cautious in deciphering their account and listening to the radio broadcast in order to come up with a scientific form of finding. Now, there were some who had great problems with Angkor, and it's not in this book, but it's elsewhere, that I state that I selected the most acceptable accounts for Westerners. I didn't take the most horrific ones because I knew that they would not be given credits or taken. And I wanted to give testimonies for which stood on their own as quite solid.
2 days ago, Mr. Poncho, you yourself testified that when it comes to refugees, we have to be careful because we would like to seek the truth. And refugees, I quote you, would exaggerate information because they had suffered. Would you be able to explain how you were able to ascertain whether refugees were giving accurate information or exaggerated information?
Well, firstly, there was the manner in which they were speaking. And at the time, as I understood Cambodia quite well, I would ask them first, where are you from? And they would respond, for example, I come from near Poi Pet. Who did you see? And I saw so-and-so and such and such. And then in the neighboring village, Koi Tok, what did you see there? And then by connecting the places, I was able to extract very specific information and judge whether or not they were telling me the truth. I don't have the training of a journalist. I seek the meaning of words that are found in the Bible. So it's by configuring words and confronting them with each other and placing them in a sort of historical and cultural context that we can arrive at the truth. I don't claim to hold the truth on democratic Kampuchea. And even so, I must confess, yes, I'm not sure if I should say this before this chamber, but when I took my book to the publishers on the 24th of October 1976, I did ask myself, Was I mistaken? Was I wrong? I, who wanted to help the Cambodian people, am I doing a disservice to the Cambodian people by taking this book to the publishers? Can you understand the feeling that I had? I had reservations up until the 11th hour, and I was telling myself, do I hold in my hands the truth? And then afterwards, I answered the question. I was like, I have the truth. I am nothing compared to the drama of the Cambodians in light of their suffering. I was seeking information on Cambodia. Even to this day, I cannot fathom the cultural context, the context of terror in which millions of Cambodians lived during the odious, ghastly, horrific regime of democratic Kampuchea. But in 1976, I asked myself, am I wrong? Did I get it wrong? But, alas, I would have preferred to be wrong.
Mr. Poncho, as you are well aware, one of the frequent human traits is that people tell stories which they have heard from others and present a story which they tell as if they have lived through it themselves. Have you been able to establish that the people that you spoke to in these refugee camps actually saw the things themselves, or they had heard stories from others? And could you tell us, if you had established that, how have you done that?
When somebody appears before you because he received a gunshot in his neck, is that true or is that false? When you meet somebody in a refugee camp with burnished shoulders because they have been pulling ox carts for months and months because they have survived terror. When you meet refugees who still have scars from being whipped or from being struck with an axe, how is that a lie? In Sandan, there was a poor fellow who told me, I fell into a pit and I was killed by the Khmer Rouge. I fell into the mass pit of corpses, and then a few hours later there were some more dead bodies that fell upon me, and then a few hours later I woke up. And this is a young man called Tak Pen. One cannot possibly doubt that he is telling you that he's taking you for a ride. They were able to go into the most minute details. He talked about getting the order from Sihanouk to enter the underground, the maquis, and he didn't understand that. He was completely illiterate. He was trying to serve democratic Kampuchea for a few weeks, but when his cousin, who was a Lano soldier, was revealed, the Khmer Rouge tried to kill him, and then he tried to move over to the Khmer Rouge, and then he was captured by the Americans, who interrogated him. And then there's Nang Nurang, the village that the Americans had completely sacked in 1975, and he was only one of the few survivors. He could not possibly invent such an anecdote. And then in Siem Reap was where he ultimately escaped, and he took refuge there. Angkor was asking him, what are you doing? And he replied, I'm a peasant. I'm a peasant from the lowest classes. And Angkor had determined that Mr. Teng was a good revolutionary and that he was going to be along the border and that he was going to stand guard there. and they were stationed 50 meters from one another. And then one day, he decided to flee to Thailand because he was told something by his friend. Such details cannot be invented. We cannot possibly say that they fabricated these stories. Obviously, some can exaggerate, and there is some confabulation among certain refugees.
Of course, Mr. Poncho, I'm not saying that it can be obvious that certain accounts of detailed events are credible or not credible. I mean, you can sometimes easily see that. But in your book, you also draw conclusions from these specific incidents or tragedies or horrors that the refugees have been speaking about. Now, would it be possible that these refugees have been speaking to each other about the things that have happened to them, and then drawn their conclusions as it comes to Khmer Rouge policy or Khmer Rouge behavior of soldiers? How did you try to prevent that from happening?
Le réfugié.
A refugee provides his own personal account, and he provides as many details as he can about places, about times, about dates, who he was with, etc. I don't ask him anything about political considerations. Sometimes they provide it to me voluntarily, but I don't take it into consideration myself. The political statements I make in my book come from what I heard on the radio broadcast during Democratic Cambodia. They do not come from the refugees. Refugees were only providing me what they experienced as the so-called utopia, the abhorrent utopia of Democratic Cambodia.
I understand your question, your answer, Mr. Poncho, but this morning, for instance, you have been testifying about the behavior of lower-level cadre, which could be completely different as to what senior leaders might possibly see as policy. So how did you establish that the various refugees that you have spoken to were not the victim of an going crazy lower cadre as opposed to a victim of a certain policy?
Oui, c'est tout.
That goes to the very heart of this tribunal's problem. Are you trying individuals, or are you trying a policy or an ideology? For me, from the very start, that was the essential question that I was asking myself. You have people, including Mr. Khieu Samphan, who's present here, who had good intentions in the beginning, and then they became lost in their ideology, which was totally utopian, an ideology that was yearning for a better world. Obviously, there were some directives that were coming from the top. They were perhaps good directives, but they were entirely naive directives based on the assumption that people were good. And I think that is the fundamental line of Khmer Rouge thinking, which is consistent with the writings of French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. That is, man is good, is fundamentally good. It is society that corrupts him. There were directives being given which were thought to be good, but as I stated, There were no written directives, and so human nature, as it is, when subordinates felt inhabited by power, they did not hesitate to exercise it. I myself was a military officer. I was a very low-ranking officer, but when I had a gun in my hands, I always had to be careful not to use my power vis-à-vis the weaker. And so I'm sure that the lower-ranking cadres didn't have that sort of wisdom or hindsight to exercise like I previously was able to.
I'll move on, Mr. Poncho. While you were in the refugee camps and at one point speaking to the refugees, could you tell us what happened before you spoke to them? Did you yourself approach the refugees, or did the refugees come to you to offer their story?
Well, both cases. In France, from September 1975 to March or April 1976, it is the refugees who came looking for me. And also, each week, I would go to the shelters, the temporary shelters, where the refugees would stay for 3 weeks before being sent elsewhere. And I would talk to them. It was not the authorities in the Thai camps who would choose refugees for me. In France, I would go to the shelters, and then when they were reintegrated into society after 6 months in France, I would go see them as well. So the refugees weren't chosen for me. And when I went to Thailand, this was in June or July 1976, I checked many accounts that I had, and again, it was not the camp authorities nor the French embassy in Thailand telling me what to do. I am old enough to manage on my own. And indeed, for example, after 1979, when the Khmer people fled to Thailand, the only camp where I had trouble interviewing people was Sit Bay, that was managed by Ranarit from the Funsimpek. And in the Khmer Rouge camps, it was very, very difficult to question people. But, however, the people were taken aside, and they would speak. And as soon as somebody arrived, then things changed. But we managed, even in the Khmer Rouge camps, to get information. But let's get back to my book. It's in 1976, and there the camp authorities had nothing to say, absolutely nothing to say. I was not confronting them, but I would choose refugees on my own, by chance. I must confess, by chance, by the people I met, by chance.
Are you able, I realize it's a long time ago, but are you able to say from the 94 accounts of refugees which number of these 94 came directly to you wanting to tell their story, and the ones that you approached?
Well, I can't tell you. I really can't tell you. I met the refugees like that, and I had other things to think about, that one day I would be asked on about the origin of the refugees, so I can't answer that question.
Yesterday, Mr. Poncho, you were speaking about the camps in Thailand, and you said you testified yesterday that from 1975 to 1976 there were around 20 refugee camps along the border. And later you have testified that from 1975 until 1978 there were about 50,000 refugees in Thailand. Are you able to make a differentiation in that number? More specifically, are you able to say how many refugees there were in the camps when you spoke to them and when you wrote down their accounts? So do you know how many refugees there were in the camps before you published your book?
The number of refugees did not change a lot from 1976 to 1978, because yesterday we were, of course, interrupted because of the translation issues, but I would like to tell you again, the Thai policy with General Chow Valet, who should be tried, in fact, well, Chow Valet's policy would change from month to month, and he had many refugees executed who crossed the border. I have a list, unfortunately I have this list in Paris, where there are a certain number of places listed where the Khmer refugees were slaughtered by the Thai army under the orders of General Chow Valet. So there were about 20 or 25 camps along the border. It started in Mai Hut, Watchman, Ban Laim, Kamput, etc., all the way to Ubon. And there were camps, Watchman, for example, which is close to Chantaburi, where there were only soldiers. And automatically, of course, when there are soldiers, people will pay attention. But the soldiers give you information on their comrades who were killed. And in Kamput, you only had civilians. Well, there, you saw civilians coming from different regions. In Ubon, at the eastern side of Cambodia, I met a young man who became my secretary, and he had walked for 27 days. He came from Kompong Cham. He walked 27 days to the Thai border. And he was still imagining that his wife was still alive, as well as his 7 children. And in 1979, he learned that his wife had been killed the day he left, as well as his 7 children, that he was a traitor. So this is chance, basically. Chance that put me in contact with such people. This was not calculated ahead of time. So the refugees, about 50,000, came in different phases, especially at the beginning, and then the number of refugees was pretty much stable.
So to make sure that I understand correctly, the maximum amount of refugees between 1975 and 79 was 50,000. And at other times it was less.
Oui, c'est exact.
Yes, that's so. At the beginning, when I crossed the border, as I said to you yesterday, and I'm repeating today, that there were a few thousand refugees. And I was in contact with them, but I didn't question them because they had just stepped out of Cambodia like me. And then during the first weeks, several other thousands of refugees arrived. And as I said to you, the first phase, corrects the interpreter, was made up of servicemen and then officials and then people of Chinese origin. And then as of 76, a new phase, intellectuals and school teachers. And many, many school teachers I met had fled in January 1976. It's quite surprising. And then afterwards, the peasants started fleeing.
I have seen numbers of the the total amount of refugees who were in refugee camps in Thailand after the Vietnamese invaded Cambodia. And I've seen numbers rising to 1 million. Have you seen that yourself? Is that correct?
Of course. And here, I would say we cannot speak about refugees. You could say that these were people who were displaced. Yesterday, I was interrupted, and rightfully so. There was a first wave of refugees from 7 January 1979 to 17 or 18 June 1979. There were about 80,000 refugees who left Cambodia to Thailand. And these refugees belonged to the upper classes that had not been decimated by the Khmer Rouge. And therefore teachers, doctors, people who were rather from the upper middle classes who had lost their families. And then there was a terrible famine in Cambodia that followed the quote-unquote liberation or the occupation of Cambodia, according to your ideological belief, especially as of September 1979. And then it wasn't hundreds of thousands, but millions of Cambodians who fled to Thailand. And the international community, with very organized a land bridge, and the intentions can be very much commented. And it was north of Arana Pratet. The UNICEF and the Red Cross would distribute food supplies and seeds to the Cambodian people. And then there was some kind of windfall of carts coming, thousands and thousands of ox carts that were coming to pick up supplies and seedlings. So this was more population being displaced than refugees, and there were millions and millions. I'll repeat the figure again, millions and millions. And the Vietnamese army would allow this, or would turn a blind eye. It depended on the period. And then at the end of 1979, the Thai government, probably advised by China, opened the camps inside Thailand. For example, there's a famous camp, which is the Khao Widong camp, and which is about 30 kilometers inside Thailand. Opened the camps to attract these people looking for food, and among these people, and there were about 150,000 refugees in Khao Widong, and there the Thai army would recruit soldiers to go chase the Vietnamese out of Cambodia. All of this is part of world geopolitics. China opposed to the Soviet Union, which was present in Cambodia through the Vietnamese. And then, again, as of 1984, the Vietnamese army, supported by the Cambodian army, by Mr. Hun Sen, cleansed the border. And there were about 400,000 refugees which were not legally termed as refugees, but as displaced people who sought refuge inside Thailand. We did not call these camps refugee camps, but we called them sites. For example, there was the site number 2. Site number 2, where there were about 200,000 people, which was larger than Phnom Penh. There was Site 8, which was the Khmer Rouge site. And a bit further, there was a site called Soksan, maybe where there were also Khmer Rouge, and there was another site at Otrao, which was also a Khmer Rouge camp. And then there was Site B, where there were about 80,000 people run by the Funsin Pek. And all of these sites were used as back bases for the different troops to go attack the troops of the People's Republic of Kampuchea, where Mr. Hun Sen was prime minister. So, of course, we can comment on the international aid to these displaced people, which obviously was not neutral. So this issue of refugees and displaced people in Thailand is a touchy issue, depending on the periods.
Thank you, Mr. Poncho. Something completely different. Today, yesterday, and the day before yesterday, you spoke extensively about Mr. Khieu Samphan. Yesterday, only once you mentioned Nguyen Chia. My question to you is, and that is a very precise question, would you be able to tell the Chamber when the first time was you actually heard the name of Nguyen Chia?
I don't know exactly when. I probably heard his name over the radio, but since I did not know this gentleman, I didn't pay much attention. I did not remember his name. And even regarding the Vietnamese Army trial in August 1979, Mr. Nguyen Chia is not mentioned. It's only the Pol Pot Ieng Sari gang that is being prosecuted. Mr. Khieu Samphan is also not mentioned. And curiously, I insist upon this, curiously, because Nguyen Chia, based on the last book by Locard, was the person who had been trained by the Vietnamese to interrogate people. You know that the communist Vietnamese would train people to interrogate. And in 1979, the Vietnamese thought that Nguyen Chia was probably their man in Cambodia, but they were wrong. And this is why he is not mentioned in the August 1979 trials. Only Ieng Sari, Pol Pot, and the Pol Pot Ieng Sari gang is being prosecuted.
The President, Mr. Witness, you appear to be straying away from the scope of the question being asked. Could you confine to responding only to the question being put to you, please?
Just one small additional question on Nguyen Chia, and because you brought it up, the let's call it the show trial in '79 against the Pol Pot Ieng Sari clique, as it is called. Have you been following that trial? And if yes, have you ever heard the name of Nguyen Chia being mentioned in the framework of that trial?
No, Nguyen Chia was never mentioned, nor was Khieu Samphan. It was the Pol Pot Ieng Sari clique only. Maybe because Khieu Samphan was not known. And Nguyen Chia because he was the man in Cambodia for the Vietnamese. Just look at Locard's book, Henri Locard's book.
Thank you, Mr. Poncho. Mr. President, I'm almost done. I have one small, not very important question, but that goes to the translation of Khmer into English. The day before yesterday, you were speaking about Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon. And according to my Khmer colleagues, you used a specific letter or word in Khmer to describe both of them. And that hasn't come through in our English translation. As I understand it, and maybe I'm wrong, but as I understand it, you have said, A Kissinger, A Nixon, meaning contemptible Kissinger and contemptible Nixon. Is that correct? Has that been lost in translation?
Non.
No, that was correct, because these are people I profoundly despise.
Maybe for the record, you said, when the microphone was off, you said a few times yes. This means that you have actually used that Khmer word, which apparently has not been translated properly. Is that correct?
The President, Mr. Witness, you should not respond to this because it is not relevant to the fact at issue.
Mr. President, I agree entirely that from the content perspective it's not relevant, but I'm just finding out what the exact rules are when it comes to interpretation. Although on many occasions the witness has argued or stated or testified what he thinks about Kissinger and Nixon, so that it's abundantly clear. But somehow, I don't know how that goes in reality. It is not being translated, and I've been pointed out that particular fact by my Cambodian colleagues, and that's why I wanted to have clarification. Not so much when it comes to the content.
The witness, I would like to ask Mr. President, yesterday I read the statement I also mentioned yesterday. I noted that some of the words used do not correspond to my thought. Perhaps it's due to the interpretation. The President, the court is aware of this, and we will resort to the language you used in the court. If you speak in Khmer, then we will have to verify your expression in Khmer as the original source of information. So it is the practice here that we will check the three languages used in the court equally. So we will do our best to make sure we get the most of it. Mr. Witness. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. Poncho, I finished my examination. I would like to thank you very much for your answers. Thank you.
Counsel Son Arun. Good morning, Mr. President and Your Honors, and good morning, Mr. Francois Poncho. I am the co-counsel for Mr. Nuon Chea. I have no questions to put to you. Nonetheless, I would like to thank you very much indeed for being here, and I wish you all the best. And thank you, Mr. President. The President, thank you, Mr. Francois Poncho. Your testimony has now come to an end, and you are now excused. You may return to your residence or where you would like to go, and the chamber would like to thank you very much for your time giving the testimonies during these 2.5 days. We know that you have been very patient and you have done your best to provide the court with your accounts, and the chamber will take this into account, and we wish you all the best. Court officer is now instructed to assist Mr. Witness to be returned home safe and sound. You can work with the Western unit to coordinate this trip, and it is now appropriate moment already for lunch adjournment. But before that, the chamber wishes to inform that the hearing for today is adjourned. The next sessions would only be resumed by Monday at 9 a.m. Monday the 22nd of April 2013, when we will be hearing TC 110 questions to be put by the prosecution. And the chamber wishes to inform the parties to the proceedings that from 1:30 p.m. the chamber will conduct also a public hearing concerning the request by counsels for Mr. Kyusumpon for release. And counsels for Mr. Kyusumpon and the co-prosecutors will be part of these proceedings during this afternoon. And during this afternoon session, the chamber also will allow counsels for Mr. Nuon Chea and lead co-lawyers for the civil parties and the civil parties to be present in the courtroom as the observers. The President, security personnel are now instructed to bring Mr. Nuon Chea and Kyusumpon to the detention facility and have them returned to the courtroom on Monday, the 22nd of April 2013. And the chamber will adjourn from now until 1:30. But by 1:30, security personnel are instructed to bring Mr. Kyusumpon back to the courtroom.